to be here, and before we start, a big fat congratulations to Eleanor for this beautiful book.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you all for coming as well.
This book came to me first in manuscript form. Alan and Unwin asked me to read it to see whether I might provide a quote, and I said, so what's it about? And they said, it's about leprosy. I was like, I don't know if I want to read a book about leprosy, so I give it a shot. And I opened it up, and the book is just beautiful. It's a beautiful love story, it's a beautiful family story, and more than anything, it's a story of where I live. I live in Malabar, and the story is set in Little Bay, and it's a place where I run, it's a place where I swim, so it was so close to me, it was almost like coming home. And while I was reading it, I think I quite finished it, as I want to do, given Long Bay is our local, I went to the art gallery at Long Bay, which you might know as the Boomgate Gallery, or if you're from Balmain, you may not know it all. And I'd met the curator a couple of times before, Damien. I don't think he really knew me, but we knew each other by face. And I said, I'm reading this really great book, and it's called The Coast, and it's about this area, and I'm really, really taken. He's like, and I said, look, I'll show you. So I took out the manuscript. He said, that's my sister-in-law. How'd you get a copy of that? So it all comes full circle. This is about you tonight, Eleanor. So your novel begins in 1926, and these are the words it opens with: 16 years captive. Who's speaking, and why is she being held captive?
Thank you, Suzanne. And it's Alice that's speaking in the beginning of the book there, and she's being held captive because of the Leprosy Act of 1890 in New South Wales, which said that if you were found to have leprosy, you were forcibly removed from your home and detained and treated, but there was actually no treatment for leprosy. So you were detained in a Lazarus or an island leprosy colony for pretty much the rest of your life, generally. And Alice is a young girl who's taken away from her home, and her mother was taken away with leprosy as well. Leprosy is not a hereditary disease, but it is, there's a susceptibility which seems to run in families. So you often find in stories that there are multi-generations when you look at records of families that did have leprosy, which is now known as Hansen's disease. So it's based on, the characters in this book are based on actual records of a family with many generations who ended up at the Coast Hospital at Little Bay with leprosy, and a mother and daughter who ended up at the Coast Hospital.
It's amazing the history that there is around this little beautiful place, and you weave the history into such pretty prose. And I'm thinking, for those who haven't yet read it, or for those who have and want to hear more, I'm hoping you might read from the beginning, just to give us a taste of this book.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne. I'll take this one. So this is Alice, and she's remembering where she was taken away from. Home is a strange word for a place I've been away from nearly all my life. For Mama, Jigai is home, the place where she was born and her 2 babies. But for me, this is home, this walled prison between the hospital and the sea, our cottages, the stony, sandy soil from which we have eked a garden, the flowering coral tree, the melon patch, my oleander bushes and arum lilies, our wisteria which breaks into a pale blossom for a few weeks in spring. The ocean wind kills a delicate flower. We have learned to grow the hardiest breed. Jigai is so much bigger, in my memory at least. There's the house where the 7 of us slept, 5 children in a bed. The outdoor kitchen, the dragoon birds and carpet snakes, the muddy creek where we bathed and swam and fetched our water, washed our clothes. The creek was a puddle in the dry and flooded high and brown in the wet, banks slippery with mud which stuck to everything. The rushing sound when it was high drowned all noise, even the scream of the sulphur-crested cockatoos. In dry spells I sat on the flat stone, warmed by sun, and the sound was only a trickle, like water poured from a jug. It was this creek I crossed to go to the Jigai school. The first day of school, Gran and the little ones waved to me once I reached the opposite side. Hunter's face scrunched from crying because he was 2 years behind me and he wanted to go to school too. That feeling of happiness, despite my stiff frock and my dirty feet and the drying creek water and tightening mud on my legs, I nearly ran the whole way, to be off on my own, to be free. That feeling faded as soon as I entered the schoolyard. There I learned that my family name marked me. 2 pink-scrubbed boys, the Faber twins, came up on either side of me and each yanked the end of a plait, then screamed that their hands would fall off. They were boys who rode ponies to school, who had shoes. No one would sit next to me when we took a seat at the wooden desks with their smooth tops and inkwells, their hard benches with names carved in them. We learned reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and scripture. The books, at least, did not despise me. In the yard, the boys played marbles and the girls hopscotch, except for me. I had no older brothers to fight for me. I fought for myself, coming home with hair missing from my scalp, long red scratches on my legs and arms. You only need one friend, Gran said, kneeling by the wood stove, blowing on tinder till it caught. The mystery was how to find one. Walking home, I went deeper into the bush for silence. Under a canopy of trees, sounds are different, more distinct. The slither in leaves which might be a snake. The wet fall of rain dislodged from upturned leaves. Silence is its own solace. One can be lonely surrounded by people.
That's really, really beautiful. What I want to do is set the scene for the Lazarus. So, as I briefly said, it's part of the Little Bay area, which was first called the Coast Hospital and then Prince Henry Hospital, and now, for the most part, it's been replaced with apartments, one of which my mother lives in. It's a really beautiful area, and if you haven't been there, I'm just hoping you might be able to explain how the area is now, and then give us a picture of the Lazarus then.
Yes, so now, as you say, there are those apartments, which are a main feature of the place. But and there's the big golf courses on either side, so it's flanked by golf courses. And the beach is just, you have to go down these little paths to get to the beach. It's not easily accessible of a beach. But when you get down there, down these steep stairs, it's just like this little peaceful cove. I think it's just the most peaceful and lovely beach, surrounded by these sandstone cliffs on either side. And there are kind of gullies, and there's a lot of sandstone cliffs around there, and there's actually this sort of sandstone platform in the middle of the beach, and that actually separated the two parts of the beach when it was the Coast Hospital. So the northern side of the beach was called the Leper Beach, and only the leprosy patients used that side of the beach because you wouldn't want to get leprosy from them. And then the southern side of the beach was called the Nurses' Beach, and there was actually, I don't know if you can still see the pool. There's a little nurses' pool there, which you can still see as well. And on the northern side of the beach, you can still see this wall that was the wall of the men's lazaret, and it's a sandstone wall, and there's an arch in it, and that arch is where they would take their boat out. And when it's been raining a lot, as it has been lately, you can see the slip rails, the posts from them in the beach there. So there are a lot of parts of, and it seems like when they took down a lot of the hospital, and I know they burned the lazaret in the 1960s, but the hospital 2001 closed. And when they took down a lot of the hospital buildings, they seem to have just dumped a lot of the building material in the gullies there because there was some asbestos in the sort of gullies. But I think they've remediated it now. And there's still this amazing, which I recommend everybody go to, Prince Henry Hospital Museum and Nursing and Medical Museum, and that's in the old nurses' quarters, and a couple of wards still remain, and they've basically retained as much of the medical equipment as they could get. They said to me it was going into skips, and they were pulling it back out of skips, basically, and they've retained as much of it as they could, and they, have it. They're volunteer run most of the time. You can go and visit on a Sunday, or other times by appointment.
Thank you, Eleanor, for that. Do you have calling cards and perhaps a commission?
I don't, but I love small museums. I have a little thing for small museums, so yes, that's a favourite one. No.
It's interesting writing about history. I've written about Prague during the war and just on the outskirts of Prague, and visited after I'd written the first book. And to be around the place that you're writing about is both a blessing and a curse, because you can't unsee the modern part, and yet you can get the landscape. So the question I have for you is that your history is so accessible to you because you live around the corner, and yet is there a part that you can't unsee? So you can't unsee the apartment blocks, and when you write, do you try and erase them, or do you look back into books and back into photographs?
Yeah, it's interesting. I look at old photographs and I look at old maps and I see what it was like then, and I think I just then imagine it, and it's a very different little bay to me than it is now. Yes, the things that are the same, like the ocean and the beach and some of the cliffs, are still there, but the apartment blocks aren't there in my story at all, or in my memory. So yeah, I enter the characters in a kind of subconscious way, I think, and see it.
So why don't you take me into the Lazarus as you see it?
So there's the men's and the women's Lazarus, and they're two different areas, and they have these big fences around them, and they have a metal gate, and it has a little sort of hole in it which you can see through, and they can slide the little thing to see through it, and it says on a sign on it, "No entrance without permission." And then inside the men's Lazarus is slightly bigger, there are more cottages, and in the women's there's about 5 or 6 cottages, and there's a little garden, and there's this high fence around them as well, this high wall. So they've done their best to make a home out of it, and in all of their cottages are lots of objects and lots of trinkets, and it's not like a hospital, it's their home, because they've lived there for, they're not an ordinary patient, they've lived there for much of their lives. And the men's Lazarus doesn't get a lot of light, it's in a sort of gully, but the women's Lazarus is a bit higher up on the hill. And what else is around them is the Coast Hospital, which was the infectious diseases hospital for Sydney, and it had things like the influenza epidemic. They all came in 1919. They all came to the Coast Hospital. The smallpox epidemic, which was why the Coast Hospital opened. They had a venereal diseases ward. So they had all sorts of other patients as well. This certainly wasn't the only thing that they had, but these were their most long-term patients. These were the ones that were there the longest. And they also had a nursing training program. So a lot of nurses did their training at the Coast Hospital, which later became the Prince Henry Hospital.
It's funny because I came by cab today. Thank you, Alan. And the cab driver started talking to me and asked what I was doing here, and I explained about Eleanor's book, and his grandfather was a doctor called Conlon, Leonard Conlon, who would go to the Coast Hospital and also to the Lazarus. So it's amazing how close Sydney can be in just a couple of kilometres drive. How much we had in common. What I'm interested in now is obviously there were people who died who had been in the Lazarus and who had been in the hospital. And if you've run, there's this great running tracks. You can run from Maroubra, Malabar down Little Bay, and you keep on going and you pass a cemetery. And what's always interested me about the cemetery is some tombstones have full names and some only have initials. Do you know why that is?
Yeah, so this is, and you can go in from La Perouse on the Henry Head track, and the ones with only initials or with only first names are the leprosy patients, because they did not go, as soon as they went into the Lazarette, they changed their names because it was too shameful to let your family be associated with you. I mean, you have to think this was the most stigmatized disease of history, essentially, and so they changed their names. And when they died, they weren't allowed into ordinary cemeteries. They were only allowed into the cemetery there at the Coast Hospital, and then they didn't even have a name. They had maybe their initials, maybe a first name. Even more striking is I went up to Peel Island in Moreton Bay and did some research up there. There's a Peel Island Lazarette where all the leprosy patients from Queensland were sent until the 1940s, when the Indigenous ones were sent elsewhere. And they had numbers in their cemetery, and they have 250 numbers in their cemetery, and absolutely no names, just on numbers on white crosses.
So people simply disappeared?
They did, yeah.
What's interesting about the book as well is the misconceptions about leprosy. So if I think about leprosy, I see black charred limbs, I suppose, and limbs or fingers that are falling off. But you say that there's been a lot of misconceptions about the disease itself. So tell me what struck you in your research. What did you learn?
Yeah, so this is really part of why I wanted to write the book, is when I was doing some research into it myself, I realized that everything I knew was wrong about leprosy, and what we now call Hansen's disease. Your fingers and toes don't fall off. It attacks your nerves, and so you lose sensitivity and you end up injuring yourself. And you might wear shoes which are too tight, or you might continually injure yourself. And it also then kind of attacks, sometimes the bones become reabsorbed into your body as well, but nothing falls off. It's like, it's the sense that if you didn't feel pain, you would injure yourself all of the time, right? And it's because these people don't feel pain in their sort of, they still feel pain internally, and quite excruciating pain as well, but they don't feel pain in their nerves, like in their fingers and toes and things like that, and external, like their noses and places like that, which is why they injure themselves. So in a sense, pain is also a gift as well that we have, that keeps our bodies from continually injuring ourselves. I thought that was so interesting, and that's such a huge misconception. Sorry, Suzanne, the other big misconception about leprosy is that it's really contagious, and it's not at all. It's like it's really less contagious than so many infectious diseases. Tuberculosis, far more contagious, but nobody was separating them and putting them in a lazaret. So yeah, it's not nearly as contagious, and only sort of a percentage of the population is highly susceptible to the disease, which is why you saw it traveled through families and things like that.
And are there still lazarets in Australia, or indeed in the world now?
No. So the last lazaret in Australia closed in 1989, which is not that long ago. That's Derby in Western Australia, which only had Indigenous patients in it. But lazarets, the sort of isolation of leprosy patients around the world has gone out of use, because in the 1940s there was a drug which was actually an anti-tuberculosis drug, which was discovered at Carville, which is the big leprosy hospital for the United States in Louisiana, and it was discovered that it gets rid of all of the symptoms within 1 or 2 years, and they've since made a multi-drug solution, which is far, so it's completely curable now, and also we know that it's not that contagious, and so they've gotten rid of that habit of isolating patients. So
it's fascinating. It's everything I thought I knew, I didn't at all.
Yeah. No, I was definitely the same way. I mean, it's interesting. When I told my mother, for instance, that I was writing a book about leprosy, she was like, why would you want to do that? And it's because everything I know about it is wrong, because everything that we think about it is incorrect, and because it's a history that's just disappeared somehow. Like, it is like those Lazarus which have just been burned down. There really isn't. It's something we've tried to forget, and I think it's particularly relevant now when we think about disease and racism around disease and segregation around disease, to think about leprosy and the history of it as well.
Segregation is a big theme in the book, and the story is essentially told through 3 people, and we've spoken a little bit about Alice. But there's also Nellie and Jack. Can you tell me a little bit about Nellie and also Jack?
And Dr. Stenger too.
Later.
Yes, so Nellie or Clea is, and sorry, all the characters' names change in this book. Nearly all of them change because they have to go into Lazarus and change their names. Nellie is Alice's mother, and she is quite different than Alice, and she has grown up in a difficult situation in the Northern Rivers region, and she's illiterate as well. And it's an interesting time because you would have generations that were literate and illiterate in one family. You might have an illiterate parent and then learn to read yourself. And she also just had a difficult upbringing, and I wanted to explore with her something of this idea that I also explored in Long Bay, which is that sometimes institutionalization for women at this time, women of the working class, was actually the only time they were going to escape the essentially slavery of housework and child rearing. And this was something that that's my sister-in-law laughing really hard right now. But yeah, so that's something that they could do. So yes, and that was something I was exploring with her as well, because she actually didn't mind being in the Lazarus for various reasons. And then Jack, I had to write the history. As soon as I started doing research around leprosy in Australia, I realized I couldn't write this book without writing the story of Aboriginal Australians and leprosy as well, because it is a story of real segregation, of like double segregation, because you're segregated because you're Indigenous, and then you're segregated again within that, treated even worse because you have leprosy. Because in a lot of these, for instance in Peel Island, there were the beautiful cottages for the white patients with electricity and glass windows, and then they had these huts with dirt floors that were made out of corrugated iron with like holes cut for windows and doors for the Indigenous patients. And so I knew that I had to somehow write that story, but I also knew that it would take a lot of consultation as well. So I did do a lot of research around that too. And yes, the more research I did, the more he came alive to me as well. So he was a Yuwalari man from Engledool, not based on any real character, but also fought in World War I in the Light Horse Brigade, which there absolutely were Indigenous soldiers that did. And then when they came back, they did not get any of the recognition or any of the land grants that were given to the white soldiers.
Yeah, it's astonishing, and Jack has quite a big part to play in the book. Were there times that his was a difficult voice to have, or did he come naturally to you?
I was really hesitant to do it, and I absolutely wasn't sure that I was going to. And I was incredibly lucky that my agent, Grace Heffitz, introduced me to Nardi Simpson, who's a Yuwalare author who wrote The Song of the Crocodile. And she read the manuscript in earlier form, and she basically said, like, you have to, if you're going to do this, you have to make him a full character. You can't be afraid to do it. Mm-hmm. And I realized that, yes, I had to like fully embrace it and do it if I was, and at that stage I did, and I couldn't have done it without feedback, not just from her, but also from Yuwalare and Gamilaraay woman Frances Peters Little, who has also read it and gave me some amazing feedback as well. She's Jimmy Little's daughter as well.
Oh,
yeah, and I visited Engledool as well and met some wonderful people there. And yeah, so it was a different journey than I expected when I began the book, but it was actually, I feel like absolutely Jack belongs in there now, and he is a big part of the story, yes.
He is, and another big part of the story is not a patient, but in fact a doctor, and it's Dr. Will Stenger. And of all the characters, I think he's probably one of my favourites. Tell me a bit about him.
Yes, so he came to medicine because his father was a sheep farmer, and he absolutely did not like sheep farming, and he didn't like the kind of brutality of it, and he actually just was born to be a doctor, I suppose, but he also has some parts of his own life which he's running away from too, and which he's trying to isolate himself from. So in every sense in the book there's isolation, and there's kind of stigma running through every character's journey, I think, but there also is hopefully hope and love running through all of them as well. So it is a hopeful book, which might seem strange, being about leprosy, but I had to give my characters things to hope for and to love as well. And yes, so he's also allowed me to, he doesn't think that leprosy patients should be locked up. And there was a doctor at the Lazarus who wrote letters to the Medical Journal of Australia saying similar things as well. And I felt this kind of desire to make him into an imagined kind of character who did, I mean, in real life there was a doctor who did try to help these patients in a very big way and say they shouldn't be locked up for this.
And from those letters, those real letters, did you get a personality from that doctor, or was that a personality that you imbued Will Stenger with?
A little bit of one, yeah. I think I did, yes. Although I had to imagine, absolutely, because, I mean, dry letters to the Medical Journal of Australia don't tell you that much. I mean, the amount of research that there was some wonderful medical kind of records and things like that, but they really don't give you a lot of ways to imagine character. You have to imagine.
So there's a lot of work for the left side.
Yes. Yeah.
You won the 2020 Blake Beckett Trust Scholarship for this manuscript. How important was that?
It was very important. That was through the Australian Society of Authors and through Wendy Beckett, who sponsors that scholarship. I guess it was just a sense that the story should be told. I always knew that for me, if anything, if something is just, I'm obsessing over it, I feel like I have to write about it. And I was going to write about it regardless, but this kind of just gave me the confidence to keep going with it, to travel a little bit, to do that research, to have a wider community of people reading it. So it did actually help a lot as well.
And probably a good year for it as well. I mean, 2020 wasn't a great year for a lot of people. But to have that to look forward to and to have that confidence, did that make the year an easier one?
I think it did, yeah, absolutely. It felt like I wasn't doing it in a vacuum maybe, which I think you feel like as a writer a lot. You're like, I'm working on this thing for years. Like I literally was researching this book since 2017. Yes. And then you think, is anyone ever going to read this? Why am I writing this? What am I doing this for? So it did give me that sense. Actually, maybe somebody will read this someday, and I'm not just writing this for myself and my own sort of secret obsessions. So,
and here we are.
Yeah.
Now, I suspect that a lot of people in the audience will know you better than I know you. But nevertheless, I'm interested that you were born in the United States and raised in Germany and Pakistan, which is an interesting combination.
Yes.
How does that work?
So my father was in the State Department. He was in the US State Department, and we moved around every 3 years, depending on his posting. So yeah, it was, to me, a pretty amazing childhood. I loved that adventure as well. And I have a sister who's 18 months older who probably didn't love moving around so much. So you realize that different personality types it suits as well. But I did love it, and you know, it gave me, and when we did then settle down in the US to go to high school, I realized I had this completely different perspective of the world, and it made it quite easy to move here when I did move here, because I was used to moving.
Can we do, I wanted to ask you about Pakistan, and then I want to ask about Australia. So when you're thinking of Pakistan, first tell me, how old were you when you were in Pakistan?
I was 11 to 14.
So what are two things that immediately come to your mind when you think of Pakistan?
The muezzins, the call of in the morning, early in the morning from the mosques, you'd hear the Allah Akbar call, and that you'd just hear that, and you'd smell rubbish burning, because everybody just burned their rubbish, and there's hot sort of smoky air, and I also think about our chickens. We had these chickens that we'd bought in the markets at Eid. And they actually turned out to be roosters. And then we had, because you're living in, we never living in the United States had this, but we had a cook when we lived there, and my mother said he's going to take the chickens and he's going to grow them as pets in his village. And I don't actually think that they ever became pets.
Did you have much chicken in Pakistan?
We had a lot of chicken. Yeah.
And in Germany, how many years did you spend in Germany?
Oh, we spent 3 years there as well.
And where were you, north, south?
We were in Berlin, and it was still divided. So we were in West Berlin. Yeah.
And so did you come back with any language skills from Germany and from Pakistan?
I could speak German. In Pakistan, in Germany we learned German, and I understand it now, but I'm not great at speaking it. And we didn't learn much Urdu in Pakistan, although I can swear really well in Urdu. I wonder.
Maybe that can be for the signing table. So who wants a Pakistani swear word? Maybe that's the time for it, given we are being recorded and live streamed, as I understand it. We've about 15 minutes to go, so have your questions ready, because I'll hand over to you in a moment. And I'll repeat the questions as you say it, so don't worry about waiting for a mic. But look, I like a good love story. I hope this isn't too personal, but but you've said US, Germany, Pakistan, and then Australia. Why Australia? Yes. Australia. I spent so many years learning how to say that properly. I'm from Wollongong.
Yeah, so I met this Australian in Italy when I was backpacking in my 20s, and yeah, convinced me that I should move here, and so I did, for love. I hadn't known him very long. Yeah.
And what did you leave? You left a home? Did you leave?
I brought my dog.
You brought your dog?
I brought my dog. I brought a lot of books too, actually.
And had you finished study? Or?
I was doing a master's in teaching high school English, and I decided to drop out of it and move here for love. But it was okay because I actually was too young to teach high school anyway. I was going into the high schools and people thought I was a student, so it wasn't working out for me. Yeah, so I moved here instead.
I must say that's the opposite of my family experience. So my husband, when he came, he's my son's stepfather, and when he came to one of those school concerts, you know, the primary school concerts, one of the students was dressed up in one of the skits as a teacher. And he thought that she was actually a teacher, so, but obviously that didn't work in your favour if you're the teacher looking like a student.
No, it didn't really work out for me.
And when you first arrived in Australia, what were perhaps again two things that most struck you about Australia?
Oh, the birds, absolutely, and the ocean is amazing, but also terrifying for someone who grew up in landlocked areas. My father never knew how to swim, and I didn't really know how to swim, so I got dumped a lot at the beach. And I just was amazed by the birds here. The bird life still, I think, is fantastic. And yeah, and moving here, I also got a job as a sandwich hand in Bondi.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that there are linguistic differences. Like hot English mustard it was called English mustard when the guy asked for it, and I just slathered it on, and he was like, no. Yeah, so it was a cultural. There were things I had to get used to as well, and driving on the other side of the road.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, but no, I loved living here as well. Yeah.
And it's interesting, and you've got a body of work now as a writer, and much of it is set in Australia. Was that a surprise to you? Was it because it was here? What attracted you to historical research, often about Australia?
I think as an outsider, I see things differently, and I think that being an outsider is in some ways a gift. Like, to me, I mean, the history I grew up with, I feel like, is more boring, whereas the history you discover as an adult, you have that kind of enthusiasm about, particularly if you live among it. So I feel like that gives me this perspective of that is really quite rich, and I'm always amazed that a lot of Australian fiction set overseas, and I think that there's so many interesting stories here. But I guess that looks that way to me because I didn't grow up here too, you know, so it's unfamiliar to me. Yeah. And
is there more Australian literature to come, or more Australian stories?
Possibly, yeah. There's something, yeah. There's a few things in the works. I haven't decided what's working. Yes.
So 10 minutes now, and over to you. Who? It's always the first question. Tricky. Here we go. So tell me the question, then I'll repeat it. Yeah.
You've mentioned the word research all through this evening. What is, how do you start, and how long does it take, and how do you research it, like the passengers as well? Like, it was obviously so well researched. What is that process?
So the question's about research, and the question is, how do you start a process that is obviously very involved, including when you research for the earlier work, the passengers?
I love research, so this is sort of what I think begins me on a story. I guess I just read everything that I can find is how I begin, and then I try to go places and talk to people, and I look at objects and I just try to see as many things from that time. I try to read books set in that time as well, listen to music set in that time. I just immersed myself in different ways in the time. I mean, with the Passengers, I was so lucky that I got to go and speak to war brides, and that was just amazing. And I went over to the US and interviewed these war brides in their 90s who were from Australia, and that was just like, I couldn't have written that novel without that. For this one, it was a lot more reading those medical records and those old sort of records and imagining, because I wasn't. And then we were lucky, we were living in the US for a year in 2019 anyway, and I went to Carville, which is the big leprosy hospital in Louisiana, and their archives and their museum there is just incredible. And the curator there, Elizabeth Scheck-Snyder, was also read the manuscript of this book, and she's just the expert on Hansen's disease. So she gave me a lot of help and information as well. So people like that, people are wonderful resources for me. Yeah.
Next question.
Thank you. Great question.
This one I can see someone that's a little bit of yes, you. Thank you. I'll repeat the question again if you say it to me.
Hello, Eleanor. Sorry, I haven't heard of you as a writer. I've lived in New Zealand for 20 years and came back. You sound like you're very historical based. I'm just wondering, does the baseness in history ground you, or does it unnerve you in terms of maybe we haven't learnt anything?
So the question is that you do a lot of historical work. Does that ground you, or does that unnerve you with the thought that perhaps we've learnt nothing?
Good question too. I think I'm always seeing parallels, so I suppose it does a bit of both. I think that it gives me, in a sense, when you're writing fiction, you have so many possibilities and it feels sort of endless, like the possibilities, the things that your characters can do. But when you're writing historical fiction, you have a map and you have to get from one point to the next in a lot of places. But you get to decide how you're going to get there. You know, I think we know the way that certain things happen in history, so that grounds me in historical fiction. What unnerves me is that things happen like the COVID pandemic while I'm writing about this, and people calling it like the China virus, and I see that they were doing exactly the same thing with leprosy. They were blaming the Chinese immigrants and saying, you know, make sure you don't buy your vegetables from them, these sorts of things. So it also unnerves me, absolutely, because I see those parallels too. And I see that, you know, have we learned? We still fear things we don't know. And remember, we were putting our groceries in the garage, you know, and not touching them at the beginning of the pandemic. It was like people were wearing gloves to the supermarket and not wanting to touch anything. And it's that same thing with leprosy. Like everyone was terrified that they would touch something and they would get leprosy from that. So,
I mean, a fascinating time to be finishing off the manuscript.
it was very.
We've got time for 1-2 questions. Here we go. Yes, thank you.
So mine's a more specific question. It's just about the language around Lazarus. It's something that I've never heard before. Is it anything to do with Lazarus, or where does that come from?
So the question is about the word Lazarus, and the question was whether it comes from the figure Lazarus or not.
From my research, I don't think that it does. Lazaret was also a quarantine place on a ship too. So it basically meant quarantine, and it became associated with leprosy, but at first it was all kinds of quarantine areas. But I didn't see it being associated with Lazarus. But yeah, I did look around that too. It is an interesting word, isn't it? They also use the word leprosarium, which is another interesting one. So the one in WA, Derby, was called a leprosarium.
And before we started today, you were saying there's been particular interest in your book, but Australia-wide, but also in the Northern Territory and WA. How do you explain that?
Because there were a lot of it really did affect the Indigenous community quite intensely in WA, and there was a lot of segregation as well. They actually had in WA something called the leper line, and it was I can't remember exactly the parallel, I think the 85th parallel. They would send all the Indigenous lepers above there, and the white ones could stay beneath that parallel. It was, and also, as I mentioned before, that the Lazarets were open, the Derby Lazaret was open until 1989. It didn't close until then. So it did spread quite a bit through the Indigenous communities up there, which I think is a susceptibility to the disease as well.
I think we've come to the end. What I'm going to do is just do a couple of thank yous myself, hand over to Eleanor, and then Dan will bid us adieu, and Eleanor will be signing her books. So thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, Dan. Thank you to the Royal Oak, our audience, and Shanti. And over to you, Eleanor.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you, Suzanne. You're a fantastic author, brilliant woman, and wonderful interviewer, for not just your time, but for your words on the cover of The Coast. So I'm very grateful. And I'd like to thank Roaring Stories for having me and for supporting local books and authors and having a wonderful bookstore, which is just amazing. I recommend you all visit it. And I would like to thank the Australian Society of Authors, the Blake Beckett Trust Scholarship, and the generosity of Wendy Beckett. I would like to thank the amazing engagement I had from Uwalare woman Nardi Simpson, Uwalare and Gamilare woman Frances Peters Little, and Uwalare elder Auntie Brenda McBride. The Prince Henry Nursing and Medical Museum at Little Bay were just amazing, and I'd like to thank them. My publisher Jane Palfreyman and agent Grace Heffitz from Left Bank Literary are incredible to have on my side. And my family is here on different sides of the room, and I'm really grateful for their continuing love and support, and also my extended family, Kate, Damien, Sylvie, Finbar, and Sal. I have several people in the US who are waking up at 5 a.m. to watch, so my love and gratitude to them, who, even though I've been away for 20 years, still support me like I left yesterday. Other friends who are here tonight, like Ashley Sinnott, who's been here twice to my launches, thank you. And my running group also get the award for 2 events in 2 weeks. So thank you, Antonia, Sylvia, and Vix. I know you're all here, and those who can't be here as well. Last but not least, I want to thank all of you for coming. And I'll thank the pub too, Royal Oak. It's been a tricky few years for bookstores, for publishers, and for the arts. So for you guys to come out and support writing and books makes this a room full of the very best people. And I wouldn't be up here without you. So thank you so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed, I think, what was really a wonderful conversation tonight, exploring what is such a wonderful book, The Coast. Please give Eleanor and Suzanne